Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm here with Loki. So today my co-presenter Loki has had his hair cut and so he's looking a lot leaner than normal and he's wearing his blue winter coat. And Loki and I also express our enormous gratitude to Ian Coulter, my collaborator, who does such excellent editing work on these videos. Without him, we couldn't do what we do. So recently we had on the channel a rather successful and popular video about Beethoven's meeting with Rossini in 1822. And it's always a lot of fun, isn't it, looking at these meetings between famous artists, because you get a glimpse of the human being, not some sort of statue or ludicrous legendary figure that isn't real. You get a glimpse of the human being, and that's always exciting. So today we're going to talk about Scriabin and Stravinsky, and you'll have noticed in recent videos we've been doing something slightly experimental, which is we edit together a bunch of shorts and create a narrative around those episodes. Well, we're doing something slightly different in this one. I'll also do some little long form bits where I talk about, very succinctly, about moments where Stravinsky's very clearly nicked an idea off Scriabin, because that's also quite fun. And then we finish off with a little bit of an appraisal. I know that there are loads of Scriabin fans out there who will be very keen to say that Scriabin's the greater composer. That's not my view. Of the two, I think ultimately Stravinsky's even more important. And although he's a thief, and he himself famously said that great artists steal, well, he certainly fulfilled his comment. And not only from Scriabin, he was a relentless thief from numerous composers. But, you know, the quality of the work is so marvellous. And we'll see it today. When he's nicking off Scriabin, he actually improves on his model. So certainly in the first example I'm going to show you in a minute. So let's get on with it. The circumstances of their meeting are intriguing, and so's the fallout, the subsequent fallout. And my main reference for this discussion is this huge volume called Stravinsky and the Russian Traditions, Volume 1. There are two of them, and it only takes you up to 1920, by Richard Taruskin. Fascinating book, huge book, and tells you all you could possibly want to know about St. Petersburg and the environment in which Stravinsky was fostered as a young composer. So the first thing Richard Taruskin says is there's virtually nothing in Stravinsky's biography that is in greater need of study, with an eye towards revision, than his relations with Scriabin. Every word Stravinsky ever published on the subject is false and biased, and must be dismissed from consideration, beginning with the statement that he and Scriabin often encountered each other in Rimsky-Korsakov's house during my years of tutelage. That's Stravinsky. So, okay, in other words, Stravinsky said lots and lots of critical things about Scriabin in his later years, in the 1950s and 60s, was essentially making it all up for Robert Kraft's benefit. This is not untypical of Stravinsky. He was a constant revisionist. You know, what Joseph Stalin was in terms of Soviet photography, Stravinsky was in terms of his life story. He was constantly revising his own attitudes about other people. And very often, what it turns out, when you look at the documentary evidence, that Stravinsky very often admired people. You know, he admired Richard Strauss. He was a big Wagnerian as a teenager. He loved Scriabin's work when he encountered it in the 1900s. But later on, he denied all these preferences. So that's just to set up the context for this discussion. And as far as I can work out, they only met each other twice. I read out from Richard Taruskin's book that Stravinsky's own recollections of meeting Scriabin are unreliable. So what actually happened, he claimed, for example, that Scriabin was often around in St. Petersburg in Stravinsky's early days, studying with Rimsky-Korsakov. That wasn't true, because Scriabin was living abroad most of the time. But he did turn up at Rimsky-Korsakov's house in 1909 because he was in St. Petersburg preparing for the premiere of Prometheus, the poem of fire, which was an absolutely major event in St. Petersburg. And all the young musicians, including Igor Stravinsky, would have been there, and they would all have been absolutely blown over by the staggering, radical, avant-garde nature, mystical character of the music. Incredible. So they were all there. This is from the recollections of Michael Nessen, who talked about a meeting on a Wednesday, a kind of soiree, where Scriabin turned up at Rimsky-Korsakov's house, and it says, the Scriabins appeared, so that's Scriabin and his wife. This is after Rimsky's death, but his wife was hosting the soiree. This account says that she came out to greet them in a hospitable mood, but Alexander Nikolaevich, that's Scriabin, extremely nervous and wearied by something or other, immediately asked to be allowed to rest for half an hour before entering the living room. Tatiana Fyodorovna seconded his request, but she herself did join us. So that's his wife. She was a pianist, a very talented pianist. Within 10 minutes, though, Scriabin showed up, completely refreshed and animated, and made immediately for the piano. It seems we all showed him nothing but vocal music. Scriabin praised everyone, and seemingly with sincerity, although of course also with condescension. These, as I recall, were his words: all the authors do please me much. All three of us, that's all three composers there, so that's him, Stravinsky, and Maximilian Steinberg, Stravinsky's big rival in his early days. All three of us were still young, and the compositions we showed were essentially still fledgling work. And it seems that Stravinsky showed Scriabin an early piece of his called The Faun and the Shepherdess. So for the first example of theft, here's an interesting one. This first example, I'm just going to play you the orchestral texture from a little transitional passage near the beginning of Scriabin's poem of Ecstasy, which he completed in 1908. And you'll hear this lovely, very Scriabin-esque, fluttering atmosphere where you have extended chords that are of no particularly fixed tonality, that are just shifting from one to the next, mixed with these sort of bird-like fluttering elements and woodwind figures. And then just compare it with Stravinsky imitating the passage just a year later in 1909 when he wrote his first great ballet for Diaghilev's company. And in the Stravinsky example, you'll see all the same elements. But the fascinating thing is that it's very clear that Stravinsky takes his model and frankly improves. Now, I'm not saying Scriabin isn't marvellous. I think that Scriabin is beautiful. But when you listen to Stravinsky, he kind of electrifies his material. He makes it go further. The rhythm's cooler. The scoring is just that much more thrilling. There's something about Stravinsky's orchestration. He's one of the greatest orchestrators in history, I think. And I often take an example when I'm talking about orchestration with students. We look quite frequently at the fantastic tone poem that Stravinsky wrote, the Chant du Rossignol, if you want to check it out. I mean, what an amazing orchestral score that is. Okay, so we've read about the early meeting in St. Petersburg, one that Scriabin probably wouldn't have remembered. So now we cut to the chase, because this is where things get interesting. We're now in October 1913. In other words, both composers are on a much more equal footing. Scriabin has been a celebrity composer for a while, a famous, radical, mystical, mysterious composer. And Stravinsky has much more recently, since 1909, become something of a celebrated figure because of his association with the Ballet Russe. He's composed the Firebird, Petrushka and the Rite of Spring, all three with huge and extravagant premieres. The Firebird and Petrushka were both huge successes, and the Rite of Spring famously had a scandalous premiere with something of a riot, certainly a lot of audience discontent, which sort of subsequently turned into quite a big success for Stravinsky and the company as well. So Stravinsky was a major young composer. And in September 1913, and we're talking only a month or two after the Rite of Spring premiere, they had a chance meeting on the Warsaw railway station, where, according to Richard Turuskin, both were catching the train to Switzerland. Stravinsky, together with his wife and children, was on his way back to Clarence from a brief late summer vacation in Österreich. He had stopped in Warsaw. Scriabin was travelling from Moscow to Lausanne to see his father, who was the Russian consul there, and to visit his mother's grave. Stravinsky, delighted with the meeting, invited Scriabin to pay him a call in Clarence. That's where, it's the same building in which he composed the Rite of Spring. And he eagerly followed up the oral invitation with a letter which makes revealing reading. Dearest Alexander Nikolaevich, let me remind you again that the train from Lausanne leaves at 10:40. At 11:30 you are at Clarence. I firmly shake your hand. Hearty greetings to your family, Igor Stravinsky. P.S. Yesterday I played your 7th sonata and my opinion has not changed. I await your arrival impatiently so that I may show you and tell you what is especially dear to me in it. And Richard Turuskin says it is practically a fan letter. So I'm just going to play a few bars from Scriabin's wonderful 6th sonata. There's a strong connection between 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th sonatas. They're all wonderful. There's huge amounts of octatonic harmony and in general, a tonality that's kind of wandering away from tonality. Heavily chromatic and, yeah, octatonic as in using alternations of tones and semitones. It's really, some people call it the diminished scale, because if you combine that diminished 7th with that diminished 7th, you get the scale. And you can create all sorts of marvellous harmony. Stravinsky himself adapts that harmony a great deal. In Petrushka, these tremolandi that I'm playing out are Petrushka ones. But in the 6th sonata, you get this opening. Got a wonderful kind of restless energy. It's all built around this weird chord, but the inner parts are moving around chromatically, and there's something, although it's in 3/4, it's hard to tell what the meter is, because Scriabin's employing a kind of fluid approach to rhythm, which is in itself rather striking. I think Stravinsky was impressed by that too. And this funny, sort of slightly mischievous gesture. He puts étrange, something strange about it, mystérieuse, concentré, mysterious, concentrated. You know, the gestures are quite weird. It's almost has a kind of a malevolent character, and I believe that Scriabin actually didn't like performing this sonata because he felt there was something evil about it. Well, I don't personally sense that. There's certainly something mischievous about it, almost like a little kind of goblin. There's something elf-like. So let's compare that opening chord. You'll remember it was this. It had that grace note, but essentially once you land on the chord, you've got a diminished chord, and then the top note, instead of being a D, instead of being a straight diminished 7th, typical of Scriabin, he's just flattened that top note so you have a C sharp over the top of a diminished chord. Now, let's just look at the famous chord in the Symphonies of Wind Instruments by Stravinsky from about a decade later. And you'll see that exactly the same chord is in the left hand. Exactly the same. Now that's clearly an indicator that we know that Stravinsky deeply admired these late sonatas of Scriabin's. Stravinsky's taken that. It's possible that he's done it subconsciously, but there's something about that spacing that's appealed to him. And then over the top, he's jammed not that chord, but the G major. A G major chord, so it has that wonderfully Stravinskyan mix of the bright, open sound. It's also a 10th, by the way, so both chords have a 10th stretch, but the left hand is diminished and the right hand is major, so you get that wonderful collision of light and dark in the chord. And it also has that beautiful Stravinsky and appoggiatura. I've done another video about this music, so if you want to listen to that, I'll put the link to that video in the video description below. So isn't that fascinating, just how the one chord, the sort of mystical, mysterious chord in Scriabin gives rise to this perhaps weirder chord of Stravinsky's from a decade later. And that whole thing of having a big 10th span, well, it's discernible even at the beginning of if you recognise this. The Symphony of Psalms begins with a double chord in the whole orchestra with an E minor chord very high in the flutes, I seem to remember, and the same chord but 3 octaves below in the trombones, I seem to remember, or trombones with timps, and it's really fascinating scoring. There's also a pianist doing it at the same time, and various other things, cor anglais and so on. It's a big wind ensemble. But you've got the 10th in the right hand is mirrored by the 10th in the left hand. But to some extent, though it sounds nothing like Scriabin, the physicality of the chord is like Scriabin, this massive thing. You can see the connection with Scriabin 6. So I think there's an interesting example of influence that's not immediately detectable, and often the best examples of imitation aren't immediately detectable. I read out Stravinsky's fan letter to Scriabin, and in it he'd invited Scriabin to come and visit him in Clarence, where he'd recently written the Rite of Spring. This is in 1913. Scriabin replied by telegram that he would not be able to make the trip. There's very much the sense that he's the older statesman. He doesn't need to make the trip. Stravinsky has to come to him. And so Stravinsky did. He travelled to Lausanne, where Scriabin was staying. He arrived at noon on Monday, the 6th of October, and stayed until 7 p.m. Scriabin played over parts of his 8th, 9th, and 10th piano sonatas. So these are major, new, radical new piano compositions in Scriabin's most advanced harmony, bordering on atonality, a sort of Russian mystical atonality. This meeting obviously marked the apex of the Stravinsky-Scriabin relationship, says Richard Taruskin. Stravinsky's description of it to his friends contradicts his later accounts in his conversations with Robert Kraft. And Taruskin adds that although Stravinsky's respect and admiration were very great, they were entirely unrequited, and this is what turned him so bitterly against Scriabin in later years. So we have a meeting between these two composers. Stravinsky's kind of desperate for Scriabin to acknowledge him as a leading composer, and it doesn't really happen. These are two absolutely egotistical artists encountering each other. The junior figure is a big Scriabin fan, and he really wants the older composer to acknowledge his status, and Scriabin doesn't. It says Scriabin must have been cordial enough to Stravinsky that October day in 1913, though a letter to his mistress suggests that the younger composer had outstayed his welcome. And that letter says, "Tusiki, I stand guilty before you. It's been 3 days since I've written you. Yesterday, what prevented me from communing with my darling was Stravinsky, brackets, a composer, close brackets, who is staying here in Switzerland. He came at 12 and sat till 7. There's very much a sense that Scriabin found that something of an imposition, even something of a bore. Okay, so we're going to finish off this discussion about Stravinsky and Scriabin. They met in October 1913. Stravinsky travelled all the way to Lausanne, had spent several hours in Scriabin's presence. Scriabin had played him lots of piano music. And then Richard Truskin says Stravinsky, for his part, at the end of all this, left with a slightly sour taste in his mouth. Despite his pleasure in Scriabin's company and in the music he'd heard, he wrote to Dejanovsky, who was a friend of his, "It rather startled me that Scriabin knows nothing about my compositions and speaks of them from hearsay. He says he's amazed at all the Paris noise about Le Sacre, since someone told him that I, in fact, am just doing the same old thing." In other words, Scriabin's been told by one of his friends that Stravinsky's a kind of Kushkist. He's like an imitator of the mighty handful of the Russian Five. So there's this sort of idea that Stravinsky's just a sort of imitation Russian composer. That's the implication, I think. Dejanovsky replied in his letter back to Stravinsky, "What you tell me about Scriabin in your compositions does not surprise me at all, because in general, Scriabin doesn't know anyone else's music. I mean, he's such an egotist, he doesn't listen to anything. Perhaps this is not due to any particular reluctance on his part as much as to the tenor of life that has developed at home under his wife's influence and outside the house, under the influence of flatterers and obsequious types." So it looks as if the source of Stravinsky's later bitterness about Scriabin was essentially that Scriabin never bothered to listen to his music or find out more about it, viewing him as just a minor figure or an imitator of other figures in the Russian tradition. Nevertheless, news of Scriabin's death in May 1915, troubled him deeply. He wrote to Prokofiev, "What a horror. Scriabin's death, I simply can't get over it. I wanted to read in the papers some details about this terrible death, but instead of what interested me, I came across a sea of the usual journalistic stupidity and banality." Scriabin, of course, died very suddenly, and I think it was from septicemia. So that was a terrible blow. And Stravinsky, who was a big fan of Scriabin's work at that time, clearly upset about it. So many years later, in the 1950s, Stravinsky had his famous conversations with Robert Kraft, and by that stage in his life, his view of Scriabin had changed enormously, and he tended to make very catty comments about him. Here's a typical example. Stravinsky's talking about St. Petersburg and the culture of that period and the new music preferences of the group of people that he was with. This is really the Rimsky-Korsakov circle. It says, "Not Ravel or Mahler or Debussy or Strauss was esteemed so highly for the qualities of quintessential modernity, however, as our local genius, Alexander Scriabin. The Poème Divin, Prometheus, and the Poème de l'Ecstasy, those severe cases of musical emphysema, as well as the more interesting Seventh Sonata, were thought to be as up-to-date as the Paris metro." So typically quite funny, but actually not really indicative of how Stravinsky himself felt at that time. So in the narrative of the first meeting that I've just read about when Scriabin came to Mrs. Rimsky-Korsakov's house and met these young composers, the work that he'd been rehearsing and was exhausted by was Prometheus. And the interesting thing in Prometheus is the whole piece is dominated by the famous mystic chord, which is that marvellous thing. In Prometheus, it occurs in all sorts of transpositions and combinations, but that's the essence of virtually all the harmony in the piece. But actually, when you look at it in detail, what you find is it's essentially a French sixth. If you're not sure what a French sixth is, check out the video on this channel about sixths or sixth chords of various kinds. I'll put in the details below. The French sixth is essentially two tritones. You've got this one, in Scriabin's case C and F sharp, and then you've got B flat and E. Actually, a French sixth, that would be A sharp and E, but it's the same thing. And then on top of that, he piles a couple of fourths. So you have this, because of course if you pile fourths on top of any chord, they sort of stretch on forever. They have that kind of upward, eternal quality. So you've got a French sixth supporting a stack of fourths, and that gives you the mystic chord. To some extent, I think all this sort of thinking about harmony derives from Wagner's famous Tristan chord, which is also a sort of altered French sixth. That's a French sixth, so Wagner's just flattened the top note. So this very interesting thinking about chords, verticals, combinations of pitches that can give you a sort of spiritual experience. This was a mystical idea that Scriabin had. Stravinsky shared that idea, or no doubt was influenced by that idea, but not really in a mystical sense, except for one curious mystical piece called Zvezdoliki, the King of the Stars, which is a very Scriabin-esque choral and orchestral piece that Stravinsky wrote at the same time as the Rite of Spring. It hardly ever gets played. So in that piece you have this fascinating C minor, C major mixture. Marvellous. Sort of has a kind of glow about it. That, I'm not going to go into that, except that it leads to this sort of sense of resolution, a sort of A major with the highly dissonant moves towards the more consonant. Also, the three chords are octatonic, or they all fall within an octatonic scale, which is also Scriabin-esque. Here's another rather fascinating example from very late in Scriabin's output. This is from 1914, just before he died, and it's the fourth of the preludes, Opus 74. And look at this harmony at the end. I'm just going to play the last 6 bars. Fascinating music, barely has a tonality, although you very much sense that you've landed on a major minor, just as we saw in the Stravinsky a minute ago, and these curious dissonant chords. I realise that this piece may actually post-date the Rite of Spring, although it seems very likely that Scriabin never heard the Rite of Spring. I don't think he was particularly interested. But it's interesting, this major minor business, because there's a minor chord with a major chord on the top, which creates a strong sense of resolution, but at the same time a dissonant feel. And let's look at the very beginning of the Rite of Spring, where you have A minor. So that's C is the third of A. So that's A minor. C's the third, famously on a very, very high bassoon, which gives it that famously primal, strange, slightly strangulated, double reedy sound, like a primeval instrument. And these wonderful, apparently it's based on a folk song, a Ukrainian folk song. But notice that when the horn comes in, it's a C sharp. So again, you get the same sort of collision as we had in the Scriabin, the mix of the way Stravinsky sets up the modality to feel minor, but we never have that minor resolution. We have the sort of shocking C sharp of the horn, which gives you a major. Not what you expect, and often genius is like this. It sort of sets up an expectation and then it confounds it, and that's a famous and magical example. Interesting comment on the channel today. If Scriabin lived to 60 or even 50, he'd be taken more seriously than Stravinsky. Scriabin was a composing child prodigy like a Chopin or a Mendelssohn, and his music goes way beyond anything Stravinsky composed, says the comment. It is certainly a tragedy that he never made 50. Scriabin died at the age of 43 in 1915, having just given a triumphant performance on the piano in St. Petersburg. He noticed, this is April 1915, he noticed that he had a pimple on his upper lip, which grew in what was described as fiery intensity. It sounds really horrible, and then went septic. And he died of sepsis in April 1915. Really terrible end to a great composer, to die of sepsis as a result of a spot on your lip, my goodness. So no question that that is a terrible thing. But I responded to the comment, maybe not entirely fairly, by saying Scriabin always seems to me to be someone whose career follows a very specific trajectory, right through to self-deification and then death. Now, of course, I'm being a little bit frivolous, but Scriabin had already proclaimed himself to be God in a somewhat grandiloquent philosophical article not long before his death. He also had on his desk an enormous unfinished work called Mysterium. And the idea behind that work was a week-long performance which he hoped would happen in the Himalayas, after which the world would come to an end and the transformation of the human race into nobler beings would occur. Now, this strikes me as decidedly unhinged. Scriabin was a theosophist and saw his music as some kind of mystical journey. I mean, that's evident. And the craziness of that project even outstrips the sorts of things that the German composer Karlheinz Stockhausen was doing at the end of the 20th century. But it's not dissimilar. It's just a little bit unhinged. It's a weird melting pot of mysticism and self-aggrandizing craziness. And my feeling is that kind of thing is never going to end well. Stravinsky, bless him, never had that kind of problem. Great egotist though he was, his feet were always firmly on the ground. But I have to say that even before Scriabin died, Stravinsky had written 3 works at least, which are easily as fine, possibly more important, historically, certainly more important than anything Scriabin wrote. So I would say the 3 great ballets, Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring, are simply century-defining works.